Close your eyes. It's 1980. Close your eyes for a second. Now picture this. It's Britain, 1980. The streets smell faintly of rain-soaked asphalt, fried chips, and the distant hum of a neighborhood radio leaking pop tunes through open windows. But this isn't just any year. It's a threshold. A time before smartphones, before binge-watching, before the world shrank into a screen. We often romanticize the 1980s, with its neon colors, shoulder pads, and synth-pop anthems. And while that imagery holds some truth, there's much more beneath the surface. Imagine a country caught in transition between industry and modernity, between tradition and rebellion. This wasn't just a nostalgic snapshot. It was a decade of deep contrasts and chaotic charm. Let's set the stage. Britain in 1980 was a land of terraces and tower blocks, smoky pubs and tiny corner shops. Children still played outside until the streetlights blinked on. VHS rentals were just becoming a thing, and music, well, music was something you waited all week to record off the radio, timing your fingers to pause just before the DJ spoke. But here's the catch. While the aesthetics of the 80s were loud, the shifts were louder. Politically, the country was already under Margaret Thatcher's leadership. Her economic policies were polarizing, paving the way for a new kind of British identity, tougher, individualistic, unapologetically capitalist. It wasn't just pop culture that was transforming, it was the very foundation of how Britain saw itself. And culturally, Britain was exploding. Youth were no longer just participants in society, they were its critics, its performers, and its revolutionaries. From council estates to suburban cul-de-sacs, the sound of the 80s wasn't just new wave or synth pop. It was also the sound of protest, of class tension, of finding joy despite uncertainty. Yet through all of it, there was an undeniable warmth. People still talked over fences. The milkman still came in the morning. There was community, even amidst growing disillusionment. And maybe that's why the 1980s feel so unforgettable. Not because they were perfect, but because they were personal. So, what was it really like to grow up, live, or even survive in Britain during that seismic decade? That's what we're here to explore, in memory, in meaning, and with a touch of mixtape magic. If this journey through time stirs something in you, don't forget to subscribe to the British Chronicle, your home for nostalgia, history, and everything in between. Drop a comment below. What's the first image that comes to mind when you hear the 80s? Of net curtains and neon dreams. To understand the soul of 1980s Britain, you have to walk into the homes. Not just the grand manors on the hills, but the terrace houses lining the rows of industrial towns, where net curtains fluttered in the breeze and coal fires glowed through winter fog. This was a country of class lines drawn not just in paychecks, but in wallpaper and kettle brands. The working class made do with wood chip walls, lino flooring, and dinners that stretched every penny. Think beans on toast, fish fingers, or a steaming roast on Sunday. In contrast, middle-class homes were the first to boast microwave ovens, though most had no clue how to use them beyond reheating tea. Children grew up under a different kind of roof back then. Bedrooms weren't curated for aesthetics. They were dens of toys, posters, and piles of weekly comics. The floor might be scattered with action men, or, if you were lucky, a clunky home computer that loaded games from cassette tapes. Noisy, temperamental, and thrilling. There was a rhythm to life. Mornings with the sound of kettles boiling, evenings with the glow of Coronation Street flickering in the lounge. Dads often returned home weary from work, loosened their ties, and sank into brown-carpeted sofas. Mums ran the household economy like CEOs, measuring out shopping lists to the pence, mastering the VCR to tape the shows the family would watch together later. And everywhere there was talk. People spoke face-to-face, over fences, in queues, in tiny local shops where shopkeepers knew your name and your biscuit preference. Phones had cords, conversations had patience, and friendships were measured in cups of tea, not likes. But 1980s. Britain wasn't only domestic, it was expressive, defiant, and dazzling in its diversity. Walk the high street and you'd see a fashion revolution marching past. Neon leggings, stone-washed denim, and jumpers 2 sizes too big. Style wasn't subtle, it shouted. Shoulder pads competed with skyscrapers, and hair seemed to challenge gravity itself. Teenagers especially wore their feelings. Every subculture, punks, mods, new romantics, told a story. These weren't just styles, they were statements. The eyeliner, the leather, the pins. It was a form of protest, of finding identity in a country losing its industrial heart. Music and fashion were inseparable. If you loved The Cure, you looked like The Cure. If Duran Duran was your band, your fringe said so. Yet underneath the loudness, there was vulnerability. Being young in the 80s meant writing your feelings in a diary, swapping mixtapes in school corridors, and dancing alone in your bedroom, believing no one had ever felt quite like you. And in truth, that emotional honesty might be the 1980s most underrated legacy. What memory from your own home, your school uniform days, or that one mixtape still lives rent-free in your mind? Share it below. We want to hear your stories too. Love diving deep into British life and culture? Subscribe to the British Chronicle for weekly journeys back in time. Let's remember the details that made the decade unforgettable. The tipping points: grit, glory, and growing pains. The 1980s weren't just a decade of loud fashion and louder music. Beneath the synthetic glitz, Britain was being torn and reassembled, politically, economically, and spiritually. If you lived through it, you didn't just witness change, you felt it. Margaret Thatcher had already taken the reins by 1979, and by the early 80s, her policies were reshaping the nation's DNA. For some, she was the Iron Lady who revived Britain's global standing. For others, she was the reason whole communities collapsed. The lines were clear and bitterly drawn. The defining flashpoint? The miners' strike of 1984-85. It wasn't just an economic struggle, it was a battle for identity. Coal mining wasn't just a job in places like Yorkshire or South Wales. It was life. It was family, community, legacy. When the pits closed, towns didn't just lose income, they lost purpose. Imagine it: fathers on picket lines, sons watching riot police push back against neighbors, friends divided not by opinion, but by survival. Even those who didn't live near a mine couldn't escape the debate. It was on every front page, every pub conversation, every household dinner. And it didn't stop there. The shadow of the IRA bombings was an ever-present unease. Trash bins disappeared from public places. People avoided crowded events, glancing at unattended bags with nervous eyes. Fear didn't dominate life, but it threaded through it. But amid the tension, there were moments of pure unity too. The Falklands War in 1982 stirred patriotism across the country. British flags lined windows. TV broadcasts carried live reports from the South Atlantic, many watching war unfold in real time for the first time. It was a strange blend of pride and sorrow, heroism wrapped in headlines. And yet, if the streets were tense, the airwaves were electric. In 1985, the world turned its eyes to Wembley Stadium for Live Aid, a global concert for Ethiopian famine relief. Queen's performance that day wasn't just iconic, it was almost mythical. For 20 minutes, the UK wasn't divided by class or politics, but united in rhythm, clapping along to Radio Gaga in perfect sync. Even in pop culture, the Cold War lingered. Kids grew up watching Threads, a grim BBC dramatization of nuclear war. It haunted imaginations. School drills, war documentaries, even cartoons were colored by the looming possibility of East versus West escalation. These weren't isolated events. They were collective experiences. Whether it was grief, resistance, or unfiltered pride, people felt more deeply in the 80s. Not because emotions were stronger, but because distractions were fewer. When something happened, good or bad, you lived it fully, together, as a nation. So yes, the 80s gave us big hair and boomboxes. But they also gave us resilience. They taught a generation how to protest, how to survive a recession, how to come together in crisis. The contradictions of the time, hope and hardship, protest and pageantry, defined what it meant to be British in that era. Do you remember watching Live Aid live? Or hearing about the miners' strike in your town? What moment from the 80s changed the way you saw the world? Drop a comment. We'd love to know. Want more raw, real stories from British history? Subscribe to the British Chronicle, where every week we dust off the past to understand the present. How the people endured. Pint-sized protests and teacup resilience. While Westminster argued and headlines shouted, ordinary people got on with the business of living. That's the real heartbeat of 1980s Britain. Not just what happened, but how people responded. After all, not everyone marched on picket lines or tuned into debates on Channel 4. Some were more concerned with putting dinner on the table, getting the kids ready for school, or paying the gas bill before the meter ran dry. In working-class towns where industry was vanishing overnight, pride didn't vanish with the jobs. Communities adapted. Pubs became unofficial community centers. Safe havens where grievances were aired over pints of bitter, and laughter helped dissolve despair. Evenings weren't just about escape, they were about endurance. Things were tight, but we managed, you'll often hear. And it's true. There was dignity in the doing. The rise of the dole queue became a painful reality, yet so too did the rise of second-hand ingenuity. Car boot sales boomed, people mended, reused, repurposed. A family didn't need much to feel rich: a working kettle, a full biscuit tin, and a telly that didn't flicker too badly. In many homes, a sense of solidarity grew stronger the harder things got. Young people, especially, found creative outlets in chaos. With few job prospects and little to lose, they turned to expression: art, music, activism. Graffiti wasn't just vandalism, it was public commentary. Zines circulated among punks and students like underground newspapers, USs. Music festivals became acts of resistance as much as entertainment. And fashion? It wasn't always about looking good. It was about being seen. Kids with no money still managed to look iconic, turning hand-me-downs into statements. A ripped jacket, a band tee, a spray-painted badge. That wasn't just style. That was survival with swagger. Of course, the reaction wasn't always rebellion. In quieter corners, people clung to tradition. Roast dinners still ruled Sundays. Bingo halls were packed. Church services, modest and sincere, remained a cornerstone in small towns. Some turned inward, some stood their ground, others looked for escape. But everyone, in some way, responded. And let's not forget the media's growing power. TV wasn't just entertainment, it was a national mirror. Shows like Brookside and Boys from the Black Stuff didn't sugarcoat the struggles. They showed them. For the first time, working-class voices weren't just in living rooms. They were on them. Representation mattered, and the audience began to demand more of it. Even humor became a form of protest. Satirical shows like Spitting Image didn't pull punches. Laughter became a weapon, sharp, subversive, essential. This era taught Britons not just how to cope, but how to push back. Whether with sarcasm, style, or sheer bloody-mindedness, they reminded the world that the British don't just queue quietly, they resist, rebuild, and carry on. Were you part of that wave? Did your family adapt, protest, or simply keep calm and carry on? Share your stories, because behind every big change are a million quiet, courageous responses. Want more stories about real people facing unreal times? Subscribe to the British Chronicle and be part of the conversation. This is history as it was lived, not just recorded. The echoes. We still hear legacy, lessons, and leftovers. What does a decade leave behind, once the lights dim and the mixtapes stop spinning? The 1980s in Britain were more than a moment in time. They became a mirror that still reflects through everything from pop culture to politics, from working-class resilience to teenage rebellion. You can feel its fingerprints in the most unexpected places: the way people talk about community, the rise of DIY culture, even the return of shoulder pads on the high street. Let's start with the obvious, the aesthetic legacy. Neon is no longer ironic. Vinyl is back. Synthpop echoes in modern music, and fashion designers regularly raid 1980s wardrobes for inspiration. Stranger Things didn't invent 80s nostalgia, it merely bottled what was already bubbling. The 1980s offered something more than bold color. It gave people permission to be bold, to experiment, to express without apology. That spirit remains alive, even if the perms don't. Then there's the cultural DNA the decade left behind. Mixtapes may be dead, But curated playlists? That's their grandchild. VHS tapes faded, but binge-watching owes everything to the Friday night ritual of picking the right video for family movie night. The communal nature of entertainment, watching together, reacting together, is something many miss in today's hyper-personalized media world. Back then, everyone watched the same show, and next day's conversation started with, "Did you see it?" But beyond style and screen, the 1980s gifted the UK something deeper, a cultural coming of age. The arts, TV, music, street theater, underground magazines, all became battlegrounds for identity. This was when regional voices started demanding national airtime, when working-class stories pushed their way past the velvet ropes of elite media circles. From the council estates of Liverpool to the squat houses of Camden, Britain found new voices. And more importantly, it listened. And what about the social lessons? The 80s taught a generation how to navigate hardship, not with silence, but with defiance. It showed that protest matters, that satire can speak truth, that change, though slow, starts when ordinary people refuse to accept the status quo. These are lessons we're still learning. Look around today. Calls for economic fairness, debates on housing, healthcare, and workers' rights. They echo the Thatcher era. The tools may have changed, hashtags instead of hand-painted placards, but the urgency remains. In some ways, the 80s never left us because we're still answering the same questions. And perhaps that's the real legacy. The 1980s made Britain self-aware. It peeled back the cozy curtain of post-war illusion and asked, who are we now? What do we value? Where do we go from here? Today, as we live in a world obsessed with speed, visibility, and constant updates, there's something comforting about the slower, simpler cadence of the past. Not because it was easier, but because it was more connected, more face-to-face, more human. Maybe it's in the way you still prefer tea over coffee, or how you hum an old tune while waiting in traffic. Or maybe it's in the way you remember your mum taping a show with precision, only rivaled by a heart surgeon. What part of the 1980s still lives in you? A habit? A song? A value? Let's talk about it in the comments. For deeper dives into culture, history, and the people who lived it, subscribe to the British Chronicle. This isn't just nostalgia, it's remembering with purpose. The decade that never left, remembering forward. So here we are, at the end of a decade-long detour, walking the streets of 1980s Britain, peeking behind lace curtains, rifling through cassette drawers, and listening to the nation's heartbeat under polyester and protest. But before we turn the page, let's pause and ask, was that really all there was? Because the 1980s weren't just a collection of moments frozen in nostalgia. They were a living contradiction, a decade where everything felt like it was ending and just beginning, where disco died and punk refused to, where kids grew up faster and yet clung tighter to innocence, where the future seemed terrifying, but the present was oddly magical. That's the thing about the 80s. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The fears were real, the joy was earned, and the stories, they stuck. What's astonishing is how relevant that decade still feels today. Conversations about class, identity, freedom, economic uncertainty, the role of government, they're not just history lessons, they're headlines. It's as if the 1980s handed us questions we're still trying to answer in 2025. But here's the twist. Maybe we keep returning to the 1980s, not because we miss the mixtapes or the mullets, okay, maybe the mixtapes, but because it was the last time things felt both chaotic and comprehensible. There were only 4 TV channels. You could reach someone by walking to their front door. Friendships were built over hours, not swipes. There was time. And in that time, people created meaning. They made things by hand, waited in queues, listened fully, argued loudly, loved deeply, grieved together, laughed in the dark, and when things broke, they didn't just replace them, they fixed them. In many ways, the 1980s taught us something we've almost forgotten, that culture isn't just what we consume, it's what we contribute. So now, maybe the question isn't, do you remember the 80s? Maybe it's this. What will the 2020s leave behind? Will future generations look back at us with the same mix of disbelief and admiration? Will they see a people who embraced chaos with courage? Who found ways to reconnect in a disconnected world? Who made playlists not just to entertain, but to express? Because that's what made the 80s unforgettable. They felt like they meant something. And maybe, if we remember with purpose, we can carry forward not just the colors and the quirks, but the courage too. So here's to the smell of toast and tea, to the scratchy jumpers and schoolyard dares, to awkward dances and loud opinions. To the 1980s, not just a time we lived through, but a time that lives through us. If you've made it this far, tell me, what's the one thing from the 80s you wish we had more of today? A value? A feeling? A way of living? Comment below. Your story matters too. And if this journey has stirred something in you, hit that subscribe button for the British Chronicle. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember.